Good afternoon, everyone. How are you all? Excellent. Welcome to the afternoon session. This is a panel entitled, Is American Pragmatism American? It's a real honor for me to introduce the panelists to you and to moderate the discussion, because I think it will be a wonderful conversation about aesthetics and American ideals and the question of pragmatism. Let me briefly introduce the speakers and our moderator, and then we will get started right away. Our discussant. Thank you. I will moderate, you discuss. Let me start with Joan Richardson. Joan Richardson is Distinguished Professor of English and Comparative Literature at the Graduate Center, City University of New York. She has numerous awards. She's the recipient of fellowships from the Woodrow Wilson Center, a senior fellowship from the National Endowment for the Humanities, a Mellon Arts and Society Fellowship, and most recently, she had a Guggenheim Foundation Fellowship in 2012. She's the author of numerous essays and texts in the area of American literature, with an emphasis on 19th and 20th century modernism, visual arts, pragmatism, Wallace Stevens, among other topics. Her text, A Natural History of Pragmatism, The Fact of Feeling, from Jonathan Edwards to Gertrude Stein, was published by Cambridge University Press in 2007. Because of the title of the panel, let me give a small excerpt from that work to lead into the introduction for Anne Lauterbach. Richardson writes, quote, "The work of poetry is to accommodate human beings to their creaturely actuality, stretching the perceptual vocabulary to provide space and form for the animal, for feeling, the aleatory, accidental, irrational element." The more successful the poetry, the more it focuses attention to this aspect to enable its integration and expression within the pitch-time grid of a culture. With the increasing information being gathered about human cognition since Darwin, the opposition between feeling and thinking, which shaped the syntax and grammar of our inherited ordinary language, is dissolving. The fact of feeling need only be feared if there are not forms in which it can perform its necessary function in perception. In these terms and others, Anne Lauterbach's poetry is quite successful and performs the necessary function for our perception in the present. Anne Lauterbach is the Schwab Professor of Languages and Literature here at Bard College and faculty at Milton Avery School of the Arts. She as well is author of numerous collections of poetry and many essays and writing in aesthetic theory. Her collection, Or to Begin Again, from 2009, was nominated for a National Book Award. Her recent collection is Under the Sign, published in 2013. She's as well an award-winning scholar. She's the recipient of a fellowship from the Guggenheim Foundation, the New York State Foundation for the Arts, the Ingram Merrick Foundation, and she won the prestigious MacArthur Fellowship in 1995. I do have to say, after reading her collection, Or to Begin Again, I swear that new synaptic pathways developed in my brain. Her work is really marvelous at unlocking new ideas, questions about ethics, just a torrent of images. It was remarkable. I'm quite unschooled in poetry, and it was beautiful. Our discussant is Kennen Ferguson. He is Associate Professor of Political Science at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. He's currently on sabbatical. Darn you. During the sabbatical, he's driving cross-country in a Ford F-150. I drive a pickup truck. I appreciate this. And part of the project that Kennen is engaging on in his sabbatical is to work on the question of native political theory and where is the place of native political theory in our current context. He's the author of books such as The Politics of Judgment, Aesthetics, Identity, and Political Theory, William James, Politics in the Pluriverse, from 2007, and All in the Family on Community and Incommensurability from 2012. I think of Kennen as an iconoclastic political theorist in the best sense, so I look forward to the way he will spark the discussion here. So let's get started.
First, I'd like to thank Roger Berkowitz. First, I'd like to turn on my microphone. I think you should stay closer. Thank you. I'd like to thank Roger Berkowitz and the Arendt Center for closer. Still can't hear. Now you can. For inviting me, and I also want to thank my very dear friend Anne Lauterbach, probably for so many things. We've been friends for a good many years, more than half of our lives. And we've been in conversation about pragmatism and Dewey and Emerson and William James for all of those years. So I'm going to begin, set the table, as it were, with remarks. There are, it turns out, 13 of them. So these, you can think of these as 13 ways of looking at the question posed by our panel. I'm going to announce the numbers so you know where you are in this sequence. 1, it happens that David Brooks outdid himself in exposing either his ignorance or duplicity with his op-ed piece in last Friday's New York Times. This latest embarrassment illustrates perfectly the need to set aside the trivial meaning of pragmatist as something simply practical and expedient, and to recuperate its revolutionary response to the evolutionary event, the realization that we inhabit a universe of chance with all that entails. 2, pragmatism continues the work of the Protestant Reformation, as William James indicated on more than one occasion. That work incorporating the Pauline inheritance from 1 Corinthians, as noted most recently by Marilyn Robinson in the New York Times Magazine interview this past Sunday. That inheritance in which Paul lays out the kind of communitarian behavior upon which Christian decency might depend. Those are Robinson's words. We recall in this context Charles Sanders Peirce's aspiration contained in his notion of agapism, his and William James's continuing of Henry James Sr.'s hope for society as the redeemed form of man, and the necessity of conversation in actualizing this transformation. Conversation is a game of circles, Emerson announced, where the spirit, the meaning of one speaker is picked up and translated, clarified by the next, to adjust, harmonize one to another and another voice. The singular feature of conversation, the singular feature of conversation is the conversion of the shape of an idea from one form into another. Truth happens to an idea in an ongoing conversation through time. We must not begin by talking of pure ideas, Peirce said, vagabond thoughts that tramp the public roads without any human habitation, but must begin with men and their conversation. 3, central to recall is pragmatism's respect for the past as its necessary condition, as emphasized by James. Taking the cue from Hannah Arendt's title, Between Past and Future, it would be precise to say that this is the residence of the pragmatist method. 4, Arendt. There seems to be no willed continuity in time, and hence, humanly speaking, neither past nor future, only sempiternal change. 5, it is useful to recall James's 1907 title in full, Pragmatism, a new name for some old ways of thinking, in the context of Arendt's warnings against forgetting the past and the necessary but difficult task of reworking, recuperating what is valuable from it, the treasure, in her words, the real fight. And in this context, I'd like to remind you of a passage from William James, which talks about this life. If this life be not a real fight in which something is eternally gained for the universe by success, it is no better than a game of private theatricals from which one may withdraw at will. But it feels like a real fight, as if there were something really wild in the universe which we, with all our idealities and faithfulnesses, are needed to redeem. And first of all, to redeem our own hearts from atheisms and fears. For such a half-wild, half-saved universe is our nature adapted. The deepest thing in our nature is this dumb region of the heart in which we dwell alone with our willingnesses and unwillingnesses, our faiths and fears. As through the cracks and crannies of caverns, those waters exude from the earth's bosom, which then form fountainheads of springs, so in these crepuscular depths of personality, the sources of all our outer deeds and decisions take their rise. Here is our deepest organ of communication with the nature of things. Here, possibilities, not finished facts, are the realities with which we have actively to deal. And then later, in another moment, James reminds us of the work of pragmatism. Pent in, as the pragmatist more than anyone else sees himself to be, between the whole body of funded truths squeezed from the past and the coercions of the world of sense about him, who so well as he feels the immense pressure of objective control under which our minds perform their operations. If anyone imagines that this law is lax, let him keep its commandments one day, says Emerson. We have heard much of late of the uses of imagination in science. It is high time to urge the use of a little imagination in philosophy. 6. Value, from the Latin valere, to be worth, kindred with the Sanskrit words for, there are many of them, meaning to be strong. To value something equals to care for it, protect it with one's strength. 7. John Locke in his second treatise on government. Thus, in the beginning, all the world was America. Only in that sense is America exceptional, that is, in an original relation to the universe. Before, as Locke continues and follows up in the next paragraph, making explicit the corruption brought with gold and silver and the amassing of an excess of property thereby by the few, a situation inimical to the idea of a republic, res publica, a public thing, even if not an everlasting public thing, as was the aspiration of the citizens of Rome, as Arendt reminds us, noting also the place and function of religion in binding these citizens together. In this context, we must remember that the place and function of religion is also central to Peirce and to James, who closed the second lecture chapter of Pragmatism, announcing Pragmatism. She widens the field of search for God, and who in his postscript to the varieties of religious experience observed that polytheism, rather than monotheism, would be more appropriate to the idea and actuality of pluralism that is the ground of American society. 8. Destiny, from Webster's. 1. Something to which a person or thing is destined, fortune. 2. A predetermined course of events often held to be an irresistible power or agency, synonym see fate. Destiny, manifest or otherwise, is a word notion that after the Darwinian information must be neutralized, naturalized. This presents a problem to America's inherited idea of itself as in one way or another as a city upon a hill, predestined to offer itself as model. The neutralization or naturalization of the idea of our destiny has to be simply to an idea of moving toward a destination that we individually and collectively set for ourselves. The setting of such a destination end is the crux of the pragmatist method as articulated by William James, incorporating Peirce's notion of cynicism, an extraordinarily useful and productive notion, usually translated as his idea of continuity, but which signally derives from the Greek verb meaning to hold together, as rowers on a bireme or trireme together held and pulled on the oars to move their craft to its destination against the wind. What does the pulling pull, James asks in one of those brilliantly disturbing moments in the Principles of Psychology, when he is at pains to underscore the inadequacy of our inherited language to describe our situation in it. What the pulling pulls, as rowers in willed continuity, should be preserving what is of value from a past lived into a future of if. We are ourselves rowers on the trireme, moving toward the idea of what America would be like if. James urged the giving up of ideologies and taking on the pragmatist attitude of looking away from first things, principles, categories, supposed necessities, and of looking toward last things, fruits, consequences, facts. 9. Emersonian perfectionism, as articulated most passionately by Stanley Cavell, perhaps in this recalling John Dewey, who in A Common Faith, as I was reminded as I was preparing these remarks by a student of mine about to begin work on her dissertation who happened to have graduated from Board. Dewey writes, "Belief in sudden and complete transmutation through conversion and in the objective efficacy of prayer is too easy a way out of difficulties. It leaves matters in general just about as they were before, that is, sufficiently bad so that there is additional support for the idea that only supernatural aid can better them. The position of natural intelligence is that there exists a mixture of good and evil, and that reconstruction in the direction of the good, which is indicated by ideal ends, must take place, if at all, through continued cooperative effort. This is at least enough impulse toward justice, kindliness, and order, so that if we're mobilized for action, not expecting abrupt and complete transformation to occur, the disorder, cruelty, and oppression that exist would be reduced." I would like to add here that this is precisely the attitude voiced by then Senator Obama during a famous 2007 interview with David Brooks, an occasion Brooks seems to have forgotten, going by the evidence of his op-ed piece last Friday. Brooks asked Obama whether he had ever read Reinhold Niebuhr, perhaps the purest second-generation inheritor of the aspirations and practices of James and Dewey. "I love him. He's one of my favorite philosophers," Obama replied. Brooks followed up by asking Obama what he had taken away from Niebuhr. Obama responded, as Brooks described in a rush of words, "I take away the compelling idea that there is serious evil in the world and hardship and pain, and we should be humble and modest in our belief that we can eliminate those things. But we shouldn't use that as an excuse for cynicism and inaction. I take away the sense we have to make these efforts knowing they are hard and not swinging from naive idealism to bitter realism." 10. Resistance, aversion to action, without having taken into as full account as possible the central question implicit in the pragmatist maxim, "What difference will X make?" 11. Jamesian and Peircean pragmatism is a method devised to cultivate what Arendt called the activity of thinking. 12. Pragmatism is the antidote to metaphysics devoted to common sense, to, in Wittgenstein's phrasing, bringing words back home. The full phrase is bringing words back home from their metaphysical to their everyday sense. Earlier in 1902, Peirce observed, "Every proposition that is not pure metaphysical jargon and chatter must have some possible bearing upon practice." 13. When we think about the future of the world, we always have in mind its being at the place where it would be if it continued to move as we see it moving now. We do not realize that it moves not in a straight line, but in a curve, and that its direction is always changing. That's from Wittgenstein's Culture and Value. Thanks.
Well, I guess I'll do my best here. Hi, everybody. To answer our question, is American pragmatism American within the context of this year's Arendt conference on the unmaking of American values, one would have to ask first what American pragmatism is. Since my dear friend and distinguished colleague Joan Richardson has written 2 remarkable books on the subject, and since I am neither scholar nor philosopher, I will not attempt a definition, but rather to say a few notational things about my sense of how my readings of pragmatism have informed me, an American poet. The nexus of thought around American pragmatism has been of interest to me for a long time, perhaps since childhood, when I first understood that the small school I attended on 11th Street in Manhattan was founded on John Dewey's idea of education. Who John Dewey was or what these ideas were, I did not know, but I understood that the principal teaching method at work was that the best way to learn about something was to undertake it, to do it, to in fact either witness or practice it. And indeed, as William James points out in What Pragmatism Means, the word pragmatism is derived from the Greek word for action, from which our words practice and practical come. In any case, this instruction to learn by doing seemed finally to align experience as practice to knowledge. It made learning not only exhilarating, but instilled in me a nearly reckless desire to find out the actual relation between the how and what of things. If you knew the relation between the initial materials and the actual or eventual form of a thing, of something, then you were more likely to know something more than its use. And this knowledge of particular whatness would lead to a certain intimacy or familiarity, even a sense of possession. It might amount to what we call know-how. It might lead to a sense of how meanings are made. The method wasn't about expertise exactly, not about mastery or perfection. It enabled a milder sense of competence and something like an acuity of attention to the indexical relation between things, parts to wholes, actions to their consequences. It seemed to me more about a kind of testing out, an experiment that would leave traces on my young mind that would inform the next idea, the next task, the next unknown. In Art as Experience, Dewey extends an idea of engaged experience into a sense of being present in what he called a heightened vitality. He construed aesthetic experience outward, so to speak, writing that instead of signifying being shut up within one's own private feelings and sensations, it signifies active and alert commerce with the world. It signifies complete interpenetration of self and the world of objects and events. Experiment and experience are etymologically rooted in the Latin word experere, to attempt or try. For Dewey, this experiment-experience link was central to his thinking about democratic processes. Art making was what he called the germ, demonstrating how thinking and acting are in a vital continuum by which, when humans fully engage, either as makers or as recipients, viewers or listeners, we perceive how such experiences can and do change our perception of the world. The mid-20th century poet Charles Olson wrote, "What does not change is the will to change." Obama's first campaign slogan, "Change you can believe in." Today, we might ask if America has lost its will to change. Pragmatism, then, as I understand it, is a method in which thinking and doing are intimately related through an awareness of processes that give rise to a new thinking and new forms. And when William James says truth is what happens to an idea, he implies that truth itself is mobile, something that emerges over time. Truth is a kind of testing ground. That James chose the verb happens excites me. It derives from the Old English hap, which means chance or fate, and so we get happenstance and haphazard. To happen, then, is to occur or take place, but with a sense of destiny, outcome, fate. Ideas become true by way of what happens to them, indeed, according to their use. Use and usefulness are at the core of pragmatism, and is one reason that is often confused with pragmatic, which suggests doing something with its use value foremost, rather than this more subtle sense of wearing or trying it out over time, a kind of experiment. To become a poet is distinctly unpragmatic in the common sense. But to write poems with a sense of the pragmatic method is another matter. If truth is what happens to an idea, we may ask what has happened to the following ideas. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. A pragmatist is not going to imagine that truths are self-evident. Perhaps the only phrase that a pragmatist might fully accept here is the pursuit of happiness. Happiness, it so happens, derives from that same word, hap, chance or possible good fortune, that gave James happen. This right, which is attached to life and liberty as a kind of further imperative, is entailed in a distinct kind of action that involves intention and purpose, desire and risk. It involves a willingness to enter from the known into the unknown. The idea of happiness is posited in futurity as a possible outcome worthy of pursuit, rather than as a given condition. The willingness to engage in activities, the outcomes of which are uncertain, but whose intent is shared, agreed upon, held in common, is one way to think about the ideas in American pragmatism, which views the connection between past and future at the level of an almost linguistic, syntactical relation. Emerson, whose writings inspired William James, wrote, "Words are also actions, and actions are a kind of words." The pursuit of happiness would be a common goal, but the definition of what makes an individual person happy would be various and distinct. There's a sense of setting out, embarkation, a journey without a clear destination. It suggests adventure. William James, it means the open, quote, "It means the open air and possibilities of nature as against dogma, artificiality, and the pretense of finality in truth." It appears less as a solution then than as a program for more work, and more particularly as an indication of the ways in which existing realities may be changed. What does not change is the will to change. In his great essay, Circles, from 1841, Emerson had written, "People wish to be settled. Only so far as they are unsettled is there any hope for them." Again, the choice of word is key, unsettled. We think of the early settlers to these shores, how unsettled they were as they arrived from their native ports on a whim and a wish, a hope and a dream. Emerson seems to have taken up the arrival to what he called famously this new yet unapproachable America as the instantiation of what became a specifically American value, optimism. But for Emerson, optimism is founded on the anxiety of being unsettled. To be unsettled is to be unsure of your place, quite literally. If you are unsettled, it means you must be aware of the present and alert to the possibilities for the future. How you think the consequences of your actions as a result of this attention will inform them. You will need to be quick and agile. You need to think on your feet as you attempt to align your pursuits with your choices and to gauge the outcome. You must think about the consequences of your actions. It's a game of if, then. You should not settle for just any outcome. Reality, I take it, is the ensemble of habits, beliefs, and behaviors that constitute our sense of being in the world. The true is a trait of the moral intellect as it negotiates its relation to the real. It guides the unsettled self to choose the good over the bad when she is acting on her awareness of how things happen. So, a set of alignments: unsettled or attentive thought with action, action with the true, which chooses good over evil, right over wrong. These bare considerations are part of what I understand the pragmatic disposition to entail. They offer an American ideal of optimism and hope through the agency of consideration of the consequence of what we do as a continuation of what we say or think, thwarting hypocrisy and suggesting an active, alert relation between personal, social, cultural, and political enterprises and their institutions. Is American pragmatism American? I can only hope.
I'm going to take my role as a discussant not to attack these papers or even to ask my own questions, but to suggest a few angles from which you can ask even further questions of these excellent presentations. Namely, I'm going to emphasize four of them, which both exaggerate and try to close the gap of 100+ years between us and the birth of pragmatism. So the first of these might be very specifically oriented to the question of the American nature of pragmatism, because I'd want to emphasize the ways in which pragmatism, though coming from the United States, instantly became international, that there were pragmatic groups that sprung up in Russia, in Italy, and probably the most famous philosopher of the early 20th century in Europe, Henri Bergson, was so taken by pragmatism that he arranged to have it translated into French and to write the introduction to it. So pragmatism's location in America, as much as Americans have always wanted to claim it as our philosophy, was a profoundly international one from its inception. The second one is that of the pluralism inherent in pragmatism. As Richardson pointed out, there are many aspects of this. To talk about pragmatism as an American philosophy implies in some ways that there is an America. And pragmatism as a unsettled, various, and plural dynamic starts to undermine some of the assumptions that come out of even our use of the idea of America. Connected to that is my third point, is the way in which pragmatism became the foundation of the early 20th century anti-imperialism at a moment when the United States was engaged in imperial projects around the world as a consequence of the Spanish-American War. Suddenly there was a kind of attitude toward American power that said, in William James's word, we don't understand our own souls. How can we understand the souls of the Filipinos? And it's interesting that though there were kinds of anti-imperialism that pre-existed pragmatism, those tended to be more what we would think of as the Joseph Conrad version. Like, what are we doing over there? It's harming our souls to be murdering all those people. As opposed to the pragmatic one, which is they need to find their way in the world the same way that we do. And finally, and I think connected very closely to what Lauterbach was recently saying, we can ask questions about pragmatism's relationship to what we've always considered, or had always considered, philosophy's externalities, the things that philosophy thought it wasn't about. So things like bodies, emotions, practices, and even words themselves. That philosophers had always thought of words as being this neutral mechanism, a tool by which they put down their ideas. The ideas were real, the words were just partial. And this attention to the wordiness of philosophy that the pragmatists paid attention to, and also Wittgenstein in his interactions with James paid attention to, I think is another way of asking these questions about the nature of pragmatism. So I leave you with those invitations as opposed to questions.
So I would invite you to respond if you want, or we can open the floor.
I guess, right. Sorry. I'm very grateful to be reminded of the. There was in 1908, I believe, that Arthur O. Lovejoy wrote a piece called "The 13 Pragmatisms." Already a year after the publication of Pragmatism, there were on many different varieties of the practice, and of course, the whole point of pragmatism is that given the Darwinian information that each one of us, though we share common languages or societal practices, each one of us has an individual somatic time, place, vector, and a particular way of organizing our thinking and experience. So the pragmatic method, just as transcendentalism earlier in the 19th century, spawned any variety of transcendentalist practices. Pragmatism is designed to be a method that allows each individual to articulate using aspects and examples from personal experience, and sometimes inventing words or a new syntax in order to express what the aspiration, how one expects to get to the aspiration one is offering, and in that sense, Anne is the ideal pragmatist because of the way that she does invent language in order to express those deeper, darker recesses of feeling where real facts are made, as James said. I mean, the fact of it's a method. James reminds us, too, that, or no, actually it's Heidegger who reminds us that method comes from the Greek meaning being in the middle of the road. And so where we're always finding ourselves is in the middle of where we've come from, what has happened to us, and where we need to get to. So pragmatism is a method that addresses that, and there should be as many varieties of the method as there are individuals in a polity. So.
I just, hello? Hello? Not my friend? My friend. No. I wanted to just ask for a clarification of your last point about language. I didn't quite know what you were thinking about in relation to pragmatism and language. Could you kind of restate that just slightly?
Just the way in which the pragmatic traditions and approaches remind us that these aspects of philosophy, which philosophy had always seen as independent of thought, in fact make up what thought is. So things such as bodies and affects and the somatic and the haptic and the words that we use that both structure and are structured by us.
So basically more generous towards what I called experience, essentially.
Right. I'd like to add to that that I see James's volume as really I see varieties of principles of psychology, varieties of experience, and pragmatism is one reworking of basic sets of ideas that find that go on actually into a pluralistic universe and later essays in radical empiricism, but that very importantly in Principles of Psychology, in the famous Stream of Thought chapter 9, James reminds us how inadequate, especially the Anglo-Saxon and Germanic languages are to expressing what we know to be as creatures who are constantly in process and growing, and that we don't have words for a feeling of if, a feeling of and, a feeling of between, and we don't have a syntax to express that. And he calls on Greek and Latin and saying, well, at least in Greek and Latin with conjunctions and declensions, you have the same word changing its shape by its ending in a sentence, so you can see that concepts are not fixed. In connection with that, I was musing quite a bit last year on, I spend quite a lot of time in Greece, and I really think about it being more in Greek than being in Greece, because I've come to discover that that is what is really primary for me. And one of the things that I was pondering and musing on is that in Greek there is this voice called the middle voice, which again connects with William James, who reminds us in that same Stream of Thought chapter that it's really quite inadequate to say he thinks, she thinks, it thinks. It would be more, he, she thinks, he thinks, or she thinks. It would be much more appropriate to say it thinks, and that we are in the thinking. And this middle voice, both in the classical language and even today into the demotic, is preserved so that you are always finding yourself in the activity that you're describing. And just by accident, just last week, one of my research assistant, found this article by one of my German colleagues, who's a pragmatist, Herwig Friedel, who addresses precisely the muted middle voice in James and Dewey, and how they attempt, in their own presentation of the ideas of pragmatism, to record, at least to point out the inadequacy we have in describing our being without having this middle voice. And at the point where the middle voice, it used to be in Sanskrit and in Greek and Latin, the middle voice, the primary voices were the active and the middle voice. At the point where the passive voice begins to develop, the middle voice recedes, and it's at that point in the history of thought where subject-object distinctions begin and the binaries that we've inherited begin. So it's a brilliant piece by Herwig Friedel that I recommend to all of you. It's F-R-I-E-D-L.
Thank you. So I would welcome audience members for questions, and in keeping with tradition, I will ask for a student comment first, and folks could pick up on one of the 4 pathways that Kennen, Ferguson offered, or other things. So our student here in the front row, in the kind of fourth row. Is there a mic, or can I give you this one, or?
Thank you. Mm-hmm. All right. Thank you. Okay. With respect to the statement, truth is what happens to an idea, I'm interested in how Arendt seems to directly contest that view, saying, the chief fallacy is to believe that truth is a result which comes at the end of the thought process. Truth, on the contrary, is always the beginning of thought. Thinking is always resultless. Thinking starts after an experience of truth has struck home. So, given the importance of making distinctions, what is the distinction between pragmatism and relativism?
Good question. I don't quite understand how relativism got into that, into your question, given Arendt's non-relativistic approach to truth.
Truth is what happens to an idea. Is truth the starting point of thinking, or is thinking the starting point for truth? That's the relationship.
Well, in the Jamesian dispensation, thinking is the starting point for truth. And I think from your quotation of Arendt, truth is the starting point for thinking, right? So it's a reversal. It's an interesting one, because I wonder if that reversal actually means that they are contradicting each other, or whether they have a different actual sense of what the bearings of truth are. I think she was very much, from my reading of her, she was very much more convinced of certain kinds of sites of absolute goodness and truth, were things that she would say are eternal and in a kind of Platonic sense. And I think that James and Dewey and even Emerson were very, very interested in this new world of constant change, and that when things change, then truth should change as well. I think that's what's going, and that's my sense of it anyway.
I think maybe a bit of clarification can be offered by something that Arendt knew and that James and Peirce also knew, and that is that, again, it goes back to this problem with English and Germanic languages, where we have an idea of truth as though it is a solid, like it's Moses coming down from the mountain with the commandments. But in fact, the Greek word for that we derive our concept from is aletheia, something that is not forgotten. So that there are certain things that are not forgotten in societies that are living together, that want to continue to live together successfully, that involve what has to be preserved. And that's that part of the past that Arendt talks about. The real fight is to preserve that part of what it means to be human, and that it's our inventions and language that do it all, and we're responsible for those inventions.
Thank you. Question for Professor Richardson. I may have misunderstood something in your... Is there a connection between the 13, or do you see any common threads among the 13 ways of understanding pragmatism, or is the whole purpose to keep them separate. So I'm wondering if you can say a few more words about that, help us understand why.
Are you talking about Lovejoy's 13 pragmatisms, or the way
no,
that
the way that you presented them?
That was just a playful spin-off on Wallace Stevens' 13 Ways of Looking at a Blackbird.
So are there
they're all connected. I mean, my 13, I think, are connected.
Can you say a few words about how are they connected?
I think they're connected by underscoring the deep respect and the constant reminders that James offers of the need not to let go of what has been valuable in the past. And that includes, for Peirce and for James, it includes the practice of different kinds of religions, given that we seem to have a need for belief. And so how to honor that need for belief and to honor the differences amongst different societies and different individuals after the Darwinian event, that is, knowing that we are the ones responsible for that preservation and that continuing making of a fabric, a habit of mind in which we can live.
I just want to return to the excellent question about truth and Hannah Arendt and thinking. I mean, you can't take Heidegger out of Hannah Arendt. And thinking for Hannah Arendt is almost by definition purposeless. If you have a purpose to your thinking, like how do I organize this group of people into a union, then you are not thinking. You're using instrumental reason to strategize. And for all of her ambivalence to Heidegger, thinking remains something that is committed to its own purposelessness. So the answer, I think, to your question would be that you don't seek truth in Hannah Arendt. And all three of you have emphasized this, how close pragmatism is to Karl Marx in famous thesis of Feuerbach. The purpose of philosophy is not to understand the world, it is to transform it. And therefore the test of philosophy is always transformation. You had that in Charles Peirce, you had that in William James, you certainly have it in Dewey. And in an odd way, for all of her writing on revolution and politics, Hannah Arendt, whenever confronted with a truly radical transformation, was very, very nervous about it.
That's a great point. A question? Okay, we have a question back here. And I guess as we wait for that, I might ask all of you, based on the last comments, so pragmatism seems to offer a counter-narrative to the idea of America as a city on a hill, and its sort of doing nature, has, it seems, for all of you, Kennen and Joan in particular, a kind of anti-imperialism built into it. Is that a fair assumption about pragmatism as a practice? And so how would you think about use instrumentally versus use as competence?
Use instrumentally versus root.
Use as competence, or a kind of
competence?
Doing, a democratic doing, perhaps.
Well, when I mentioned the word competence, I was trying to point toward the idea that what I understood was happening in terms of my upbringing was that I didn't have to become excellent and perfect or do things that were excellent and perfect. But I did need to know how things worked. And so that was useful to know how things worked, and also to understand, and I don't know why this is in the present tense because I think it still guides the way I think, that once you are engaged in thinking about how things work, you automatically are engaged in some kind of sense of how other people are doing things and their relation to things. So there's a kind of continuum out from your own stuff into the world, that it might be important and very interesting. I'm just thinking of this now, that in that kind of mildness of possibility and potential, as opposed to expertise and exceptionalism, there is a kind of pullback from. There's a kind of communitarian, and what I'm trying to say is that right at the base of it is a kind of a communitarian urge or thought or thinking. I mean, thinking, not thought, but thinking, because one is situated in relation to others, and that situational relation seems endemic to even Emerson talking about being unsettled, that as soon as you're settled or sure or inside of a certain kind of certitude, then others are less, your engagement with others shifts its ground a little bit. So there's something in the spirit of it that I think is very important. And Joan's mentioning a number of times now, but we don't know how to approach it. The other part of it seems to me to be really anxious making, which has to do with the crisis in belief, which I expect that this conference is in some sense about. So what do we believe in after the Darwinian information? And what do we put our need to believe? Which James so wonderfully, he was very, very clear about it. He said it isn't what you believe in, it's that you believe. He shifts the ground. It doesn't matter what you believe in, but the fact of belief is essential to the human. So the crisis I think that we're in now, and I'm sure others have said this more eloquently, is that we don't know in what to believe. As our institutions get weaker and our sense of agency gets more confused, and the reason I brought up this question about language is that it seems to me that also that in the technological moment, our attention to language is dwindling, and we're using it as mostly efficacies of one kind or another, so it's instrumentalized as well. And all of these writers that we love I think I have to use that word, are so incredibly attentive to the choice of the word, and that choice of word has a past. Actually, I think that when James uses that very strange locution, truth is what happens to an idea, it's because he wanted to use that word happens. He wanted to make this action, this vitality of the word happening, and even its relation to touch, apparent. And that's why it's a very peculiar sentence. But I think that they all were very aware of how language affects action, actually, how it affects the way we behave.
Thank you. Now, for your question, please.
Yes. James may have wanted us to remember the past of the word happen, but in saying truth is what happens to an idea, he was polemicizing against the idea that truth is something timeless. And my question is about that. Joan Richardson in her talk alluded to an essay by Emerson, Circles, and just now Ann Lauterbach cited it as well, where he says something like, I am careful never to justify myself. I unsettle all things. I merely experiment, an endless seeker with no past at my back. And I take it from the allusions to this part of this essay that it's a sentiment congenial to at least a couple of members of this panel, and that it seems in harmony with something about the spirit of pragmatism, an endless seeker, merely experimenting with no past at his back. My question is, are there disadvantages to this situation of being a seeker with no past at your back? Do these disadvantages, if they are part of pragmatism, also answer to some of the disadvantages of America as a project?
It's important to remember that while Emerson did contradict himself quite a lot, and that he is not, as Stanley Cavell is at pains to point out, he has certainly influenced the pragmatists, but he's not to be claimed as the father of pragmatism. The pragmatists are very careful to, as the passages I read from James point out, pent in as the pragmatist is with that weight of the past. And elsewhere, Emerson does talk about the weight of, in Fate, for example, or in Experience, that we can't escape the weight of the past. And there, I don't think that we don't seek willy-nilly. We seek, I mean, pragmatism is a new name for some old ways of thinking, for ways that have served us well enough to get us from where we began, putting our hands on cave walls, to where we are now. And that's something that Peirce is very, very careful to take into account. I don't think that, I think America must realize itself as having roots in all of the linguistic and historical past, as well as in Native American roots, as Thoreau was careful to point out, and as certain other pragmatists, Bruce Wilshire, for example, has pointed out.
Is there a question in the front before? Okay. This front here.
Thank you. Our foreign policy today is being described as pragmatic. Do you think that that's an issue if we are facing a foe, or at least an opponent that claims to be of deep ideological belief?
Well, I think first of all, it's important to separate the trivial sense of pragmatic as expedient and practical from what does inform Obama and other members of the government. Sunstein is no longer within the government, but certainly they're in conversation. It is very, as policy, as a pragmatist, of course, the administration has to take into account what it means to have a conversation with someone who is ideologically driven, and to find ways that will translate what it means to perhaps get away from ideology to some larger aim, to some larger end. It's important always, I think, to remember that pragmatism is a method. It's from getting where we are to some future point, but you have to specify what your aim is. It's not just go willingly, again, not just going into a future. It's as deeply informed as one can be, and finding ways of language to make translations between different points of view.
Okay, gentleman here in the third row. Oh, it's coming to you. You may as well.
Thank you.
Everyone's doing it.
I'll go back to the little truth conversation. It seems to me that, and I'd just like your thoughts on this, that they're really not contradictory, because the way the word truth is being used is really the way I might use the word understanding. And you have understanding, it comes to you in a flash, like in the word blink, in the book Blink. And then you think about it to develop the idea, the truth of the idea more. And the more you continue to think, you then develop into a new truth, which then starts a new process, and it's really the truth, the understanding, and the thinking is really a cycle.
That's right.
And I wonder whether that perhaps would obviate that they're really different.
That's good. That's very good. That's very helpful. Thank you.
Other
Yes, I agree.
question here, please.
Thank you. I'd like to follow through on the topic, this first topic this morning. Is there still an idea of America that can inspire people to sacrifice for the common good? Mm-hmm. If we talk about honor the need for belief and how to honor diversity, and at the same time say that it's not so important what you believe, but that you believe, given the context of America seeming so stuck at this point, where do we go? Isn't it critical that somehow we develop a common consensus, a common understanding in our beliefs that will enable us to move forward and have something worth fighting for, worth willing to pursue?
It's one of those moments where I just want to say yes. The crisis is real, right? That this this notion of the common good or the shared beliefs or the values that we assume that we all have in common, the stuckness would definitely tell us that this is not the case, that we don't share those things. Now, how you dismantle that, I am, as I'm sure many people in this room are, I'm completely baffled at how the dismantling might go to revive or re-elicit or remind or bring back, or whatever way you want to construe the notion that there are certain things that, as in the Declaration of Independence, there are things that we ostensibly believe, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness being three of them. If those are the most basic things in which we believe, that are also hooked onto the notion that all men are created equal, and I'm sure women are allowed to be in that category, then something's been, if we ever believed that, that's another question historically, whether that was something that we put into the world as a linguistic event, but not necessarily held to it. I don't know how to answer your question, because I don't know that there is any single person can answer such an important and seemingly intransigent question. I'm assuming, I would like to believe that groups of people who care about these basic beliefs will find their way to be active in the world and bring it back to life. But I think there are institutions that are so crippled at this point that I don't actually know how that I think that's what I just said has a romance in it for me, because I think there's so little transparency.
I'd like to continue in responding to that. Jim Sleeper, in a piece that I read in preparation for tomorrow's panel, talks about one of the, in order to preserve and arguing for preserving an idea of national identity and working towards it, talks about the necessity for truly engaged and active pedagogy. And in that connection, in Anne's response, I was reminded of a beautiful review in the New York Review I don't know, I think, no, I've been catching up on old New York reviews. So this is in August, Gordon Wood reviewing a book by Danielle Allen called Our Declaration, a reading of the Declaration of Independence in Defense of Equality. And it's just extraordinarily helpful in this regard because she speaks directly to how alienated she was. You know, we all memorize the Declaration, in high school, but we have no idea what it means. And she took it on herself to teach it as a text, close reading and slow reading the text, and brought herself and her students to tears about what the aspirations of the polity are. And realized in the course of it that it wasn't one man, it wasn't Thomas Jefferson who drafted it. All of this was about conversation. Again, conversation is the core of what the founding pragmatists want to keep alive. Without conversation, we're lost. But I think that, sort of beginning with all of us pedagogues, sort of teaching to these documents about what do these beliefs are platforms for action. What do they entail? Do they still work? I think we need to have, last night on NP, on NewsHour, there was someone calling for a national conversation, and I think we do have to have a national conversation. We certainly have the technology for it.
Question here? Yeah.
Hello. This is for Professor Richardson. Is that how you pronounce your name? Okay.
Last time I looked.
Yeah. Well, I've been reading Hannah Arendt for quite a long time now, and she talks about the rise of the social, like this other author calls it the blob or the social realm, and to the detriment of our privacy on one hand and on the political realm on the other. How do you rate this rise of the social realm? Is it making us any happier, or do you think that James and Emerson how would they look upon this at this point?
You said something, the rise of the social, is that what you...
That's what Arendt called the realm where everyone is, social climbing, the media. I think like Facebook. I think that's really what she was looking at when she decided to call it the rise of society. Back then in Arendt's days, they had salons. Now we have just a conglomerate of entertainment. Now, how do you think that is going to lead to any more public happiness, or do you think that that's going to detract from that?
I think it's all of it is a distraction from thinking and feeling and coming to terms with it. The individual has to understand who she is as an individual before she can enter responsibly into the social. And as things are going now, there's no sense of Twitter or Facebook or tweet. I mean, everybody's not concerned with that at all. I think it's a terrible danger. I think we're in trouble.
I guess I would say, building on that question, for the pragmatism that interests the panel, you make some wonderful connections with Arendt and thinking, but Arendt also has this Republican thread and a defense of the public, which I think is her worry about the rise of the social and the reduction of the public space in which we appear to one another in this action-based idea of working for a kind of public purpose. I mean, does pragmatism, is it fundamentally an individualist kind of idea with its pluralism? Can we talk about the publicness of pragmatism or the public space that is needed in a pragmatic sense if there's not one America to be taken forward, but multiple Americas, many unremembered, many not yet known?
I'm not sure I know how to respond to that. I think that if one can only, the idea of Emersonian perfectionism that I recalled earlier, that Stanley Cavell makes, is so passionate about, you know, and it also appears in William James, again in the postscript to Varieties of Religious Experience, that the idea of moving either individually or socially is that of taking even one small half step to better one, you know, to improve, and to improve first oneself and then the group that one is in. I mean, the polity, it doesn't work as an abstract. One has to begin concretely and in small steps, and that slightly better self is already something that will improve the group.
I would add to that as Drusilla Cornell pointed out, for Arendt, there are wrong kinds of thinking. That is, there's ways to do thinking incorrectly. And I would, I think it was the very first question, I would point you to the way in which she talks about scientists, who she thinks really should not be part of a public conversation because they are dedicated to a kind of truth which is not public, it's not political, it's not contestable. And that's, I think, an important difference between an Arendtian kind of agonistics, which takes place in a certain sphere along certain lines, and the pragmatic ontology of truth, which is to say, it's all up for grabs all the way down.
And she also had this, just to go back to the question about the social, her understanding of the social was really about instrumentality, about the social being a kind of instrument, as opposed to the social, which I think actually is true, that we now use the social space as an instrument, as opposed to a place of gathering, for example. I mean, a lot of the ways in which I think these questions are going is this missing space of the common, you know, of the place where people, and the common as a kind of, almost as a physical place, like the agora or the commons that we don't gather in order to have a conversation. It's very hard to have a conversation from a distance, you know, because you can't see people's faces or hear their voices.
There was one question here, and you'll be our last question.
Thank you. Thank you. It's very interesting. I find myself oddly wanting to defend Twitter and Facebook and Snapchat. Wow. Don't tell my 16-year-old I said this. But I think there's kind of a false dichotomy there a little bit, because I as an organizer on the Lower East Side, use all of those pieces of ways of communicating, and Facebook, often you can get threads about news that you can't get anywhere else, like U.S. Uncut, et cetera, where you find out information about the world that you don't get in the New York Times. And I think that there are, you know, silos everywhere, that you can sit with your New York Times in your quiet little home and be just as siloed as somebody on Facebook, and it's really a decision to use those ways of getting information and question all of them, and then go out and organize people. That it's an active, and I love what you said about the middle voice and the active. And but I also want to remind people, because there's some things that have felt like a little despairing creeping into things, but people are organizing all over the world, you know, that there is not a passivity during this period of time. And it reminds me of Howard Zinn's analysis of the 50s, which is, it looked like nothing was happening, but everything was happening. Mm-hmm. It just wasn't on the front pages. And we just organized one of the largest climate marches in the history of history. In New York City and all over the world. And so I find this period of time utterly hopeful, utterly exciting. I mean, you have things happening near here in Hurley, New York, which, you know, everywhere people are organizing. They're doing stuff. And I would like to see more of it known about that at this school, which was my alma mater.
Could I ask you a question back?
Yep.
Which I think is, I mean, it's great that you said that, and I'm really glad that you kind of dispelled the gloom of impotence. But in your view, since you're really active in it, what is the way in which those kinds of behaviors then change the way the policy of the world is? Or
well,
do you have a sense of that?
Yeah. Right now we're organizing for the Committee on the Status of Women at the UN. We are going to use Twitter to point people to literature and writings, and you know, the Philippines use Twitter to organize a huge march in protest of things. So it's a tool, it's not a solution. And you can point people to things to read, and there are dangers in it, but there are dangers in being siloed with the New York Times, and it's class and race, and you know, we're looking at big isms here, and if Facebook and Twitter and Snapchat are a way of drawing younger people in, then I say you learn how to use them, or else.
All right. Okay. And we have...
How many people even know or read Hannah Arendt? That's a pretty problem right there.
Probably a lot of people here. So we have one last question here in the second row. Oh, here we come. Here we come.
Many decades ago, several sentences from William James drilled themselves into my head, and they were concerned with habit and how no one is more miserable than the man who has no habits, but every morning must decide which shoe to put on first, and so on. And I always think of William James as the man they named a tall building in Cambridge after, which is concerned with psychology, and James is really the grandfather of cognitive behavioral therapy. And I just wonder, I don't really have a sense of how to unite these memories with the rather philosophical and poetical James we've been discussing today. And I would appreciate that. Thank you.
In order to change a habit, I mean, habits are very, very useful because, as we know, as you pointed out, but James was, well, psychology, as I'm sure you know, began here and in Germany pretty much at the same time, and James also spent quite a lot of time himself as a young man in Germany. Cognitive behavioral therapies are designed to actually use kind of the pragmatist method on oneself. You know, look at how I am and how I would prefer to be. I will act as if I am the person that I want to become, and I slowly will, by practicing and acting that way, become that person. So I don't see that there's a disjunct.
Well, not so much a disjoint as just not being able to hear them expressed in the same paragraph.
Not being able to hear what expressed in the same paragraph?
As you all have been discussing today, and as I might pick up a text lying around William James Building and how that discusses these ideas. And I think you've just done it partly. I just wondered if there was any further explanation of the junction.
I think James spent his whole life thinking about how to translate, again, the deeper, darker recesses of character into fact, and how to begin to address. And as you probably know, one of his criticisms of Freud was that Freud had invented the whole Oedipal mythology and sexuality as an explanation of why we act the way we do, or to describe the unconscious, the residence of the unconscious. Whereas for James, as he wrote in a letter about after Freud's visit to Clark University in 1909, that for him, for James himself, the unconscious is simply that whole massive experience in deeper, darker recesses that we can't articulate. And the important thing is to find words to articulate whatever it is that the individual experiences.
Thank you.
Well, now I hope the conversation will continue, but now the panel is at an end. Let me remind you that we have a swap in the program. So the next panel will begin promptly soon, and that's Is America a Land of Freedom with Kennen Ferguson and Jerome Cohn. So a quick turnaround. Please join me in thanking our panelists.